Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Dusty Hewitt with Long Run Communications. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please note this webinar is being recorded to share what we learn with the business community. Just a few reminders. All participants should have their audio and video turned off to optimize bandwidth and minimize background noise. Please make sure your chat area is visible. That's the bubble icon in the lower toolbar. It should be selected in blue. Please utilize this space to ask any questions. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A, and we invite you to chime in when your question is being asked. Those who have joined in by phone will also have the opportunity to ask questions. Remember to turn your microphone on while you are speaking and mute while others are speaking. And with that said, I'll turn it over to Dusty.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to everyone who joined us this morning. We especially appreciate this nice-sized group in light of the fact that we're using a little bit of a different medium today. So really excited to have you all here. Hopefully we can share some information that will be helpful to you, maybe helpful now, and certainly helpful in the case of additional or future crises or problems that you, your business, or your organization might come across. As Emily said, I'm Dusty Hewitt. I am with my own company, which is Long Run Communications. One of the many things that I do for my clients is crisis communications and helping them manage through difficult and complicated situations that they find themselves in. Sometimes they are crises that are unique to their organization. Other times they are crises that everyone is experiencing, such as a pandemic. But definitely crisis communication is a hot topic these days. And I think we've all had a handful of examples, seen a handful of examples of public figures, businesses, large and small, organizations, and the like, who we think are responding well to the COVID-19 crisis, and plenty of examples of those who we find are not responding well. And in large part, that is because when public figures communicate without a strategy or without a plan, they stammer and say things that are easily misunderstood, misconstrued, misinterpreted, things that are confusing or things that make people angry. And when they communicate with strategy, although their message may not every time be universally beloved, they do get their point across and their message is understood. And clarity is one of the most important goals of crisis communication. I'm going to try to advance the slide here. So today we are going to talk a bit about some myths of public relations, the types of crises that we may encounter, and how to prepare for the next crisis, no matter what it is. Good communication is really just, it's a lot more than a way of saying something that everybody who's involved can agree on. Teams can plan really well and carefully and still do a bad job at this. Good communication, though, is effective at its core. And how do we know it's effective? Well, because it accomplishes three things. It has identified its audiences, and with those audiences, it makes them feel something, it makes them think something, and maybe most importantly, it makes them do something. So we're going to talk a bit about the myths and legends. These myths are things that you've no doubt heard, maybe even bought into over the course of your career, and I cannot stress enough that with the exception of number 3 that I made a mistake with, they are unequivocally absolutely untrue. It's not that there aren't exceptions here and there that prove these rules, it's just that when you start to trick yourself into believing these myths, it becomes a very slippery slope very quickly into a great big mess. So the first one, this is a myth, that all press is good press, and this is not true. All press is press, but it's not all good. Ask Anthony Weiner if you want proof of that. Ask, if you're of a certain age, like I am, ask Gary Hart. Bad press makes people feel and think bad things about you, bottom line. You might be able to recover from it, but that does not mean that it was helpful. The second one is you can go off the record. Now, I'm not one that's going to stand here before you today and malign the media and present them as people who are always trying to catch you or cheat you. This is just more a warning that whether it's because the reporter that you're speaking with or working with makes a mistake, an honest mistake, or is a little slippery, off-the-record comments are just not something you can count on. So it's not a good idea to take it for granted that you can go off record and not be quoted. It's just not worth the risk. Now, the third one is where I made a mistake with my wording. Silence is, I wrote silence is the enemy. And silence, the thing about it is it never stays silent for very long. So if you don't fill it with information, someone else will. It's very important for you to control your own narrative and tell the story unless you're okay with someone else doing that for you. And the fourth myth is that you're smarter than your advisors. Now, you might be smarter than your advisors, but don't count on it. If you're a politician, if you're a CEO, if your advisor's consultation isn't valuable to you, something is wrong. And it's probably the structure and the flow of how information is moving through your organization. So let's talk about the kinds of crises that can take place. What could go wrong? And the possibilities are truly endless. Most crises fall into one of these categories. So first is general category of leadership scandals. So is your CEO maybe stealing from the company? Someone's falsifying documents, suppressing employee voices, covering up fraud, someone sleeping with someone they shouldn't sleep with. This is all bad press, and it's all about the leadership. And it looks extra bad because it's your leadership when they're supposed to be leading. Two is staff misconduct. This is the category of all the things that basically everybody else in the organization could do that ends up being wrong that causes a problem for the organization. Here's where we find people in healthcare who abuse patients, people in education who neglect students, accountants who cook the books, or maintenance workers who steal supplies. This category is very inclusive, and it's basically anybody who does something they shouldn't be doing. The third category is financial catastrophes. A stock market crash maybe that wipes out a huge reserve or a fund that your organization needs. Huge changes in funding streams that have a devastating impact on your ability to operate the way you're used to. A donor who you've relied on for years just disappears. Maybe sales projections are completely off for one reason or another. And then finally, natural disaster. And if I have any insurance folks on the phone or on the call today, please don't hold me to this definition. In this category, I'm including things like earthquakes, hurricanes, and yes, pandemics. So for each of these, one of the first questions that's important to ask and acknowledge among your leadership team who's managing your crisis with you is, who did it? And the answer can be one of three potential answers. Either one, you did it, two, someone else did it, or three, no one did it. Now, you did it means maybe not you, but your organization. Ultimately, you're accountable for the thing that went wrong. Someone else did it is someone took an action that created a problem, but it wasn't you. And then no one did it. That's where I would put the natural disaster category. No one could have particularly prevented this. This is the thing that happened. People might refer to it as an act of God. These are things that are happening to you that not another human created. Now, if you did it, I'm going to let you in on a secret. You can bet that in almost every case, everybody knows you did it. There's not a lot of sense in pretending you did it in a public eye. You're just going to look kind of dumb or like a gaslighting monster, and both are bad press. So what do? Well, if you did it, you accept responsibility first. You apologize. You address the needs and the concerns that you believe are at the top of mind for your key stakeholders, your audiences that matter to you. You sympathize and empathize. You find a solution to the problem, and you tell people what the solution is and what you're doing to fix the problem. And then you keep coming back again and again with updates. And then you apologize again. Now, if someone else did it, here are the steps to follow. One, accept responsibility. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, why am I accepting responsibility if someone else did it? And I want to point out here that in the case of a crisis that was created by someone else, another organization, another individual, and even in the case of crisis that was created by no one, that just happened, it's that no one did it thing, this is a critical juncture in your crisis management. you can decide that although you may not take responsibility for creating the problem, you are assuming the mantle. You are taking authority to solve it. Put differently, you may not have started the fire, but you can extinguish it, and you can step up as an individual, as an organization, as a business, and be part of the solution. And that is a huge benefit to your organization and the way your public audiences will see you. And you probably guessed it, if no one did it, the steps are the same. It's that line between accountability and taking authority, assuming that mantle. Now, communications objectives, again, that we talked about before, have to do with how you want people, after they've consumed or read, heard your communications, your messaging, how do you want them to feel? How do you want them to think? And what do you want them to do? And these are in this order for a very specific reason. So when people see something, you're watching a movie, you see something on the news, you read something in the newspaper or online, feel is often the first response. You're going to have a feeling right away. It's going to make you feel something. You're going to feel frustrated, you're going to feel scared, you're going to feel angry, you're going to feel happy, excited, whatever that feeling is. Next, you're going to draw a conclusion. You're going to take the information you've heard and you're going to think something. It could be an opinion of an individual, an assessment of a situation, a prediction for what might be coming next. And then, and this is again very critical, and particularly I hope you're thinking about how this translates for your organization and business, what do you want someone to do? So in this case, I put on these slides, you might want your audiences to feel confident in you and optimistic about the scenario in the time of crisis. You want them to draw the conclusion and think that you're competent, that you're the right person and right organization, right team to be managing through this crisis. And maybe even that you're a visionary because you're out front on this and you are talking in ways that no one else is. And what do you want them to do? Maybe you want them to contribute. And for those of you in the nonprofit world, you might be immediately thinking contribute donor-wise, dollars-wise. But it also could mean that you want them to contribute to a solution, right? Be part of the solution and join a team that's going to move things forward. And the second bullet under do is support. And implicit in that is not impede, right? You're going to support by sharing information and talking positively about the solution, and maybe even joining a team that's going to create that solution and move that solution forward. So we can't expect any one person or certainly any team to be able to respond as nimbly as all this, no matter the crisis, right out of the gate without some decent preparation. And that's why communicating well in a crisis really takes that planning. There's a lot of it you can do in, quote, peacetime, but then there's a lot of it that you can do when you see something coming. When you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we did have a run-up period of time where, although we had a lot of questions, we also had some answers and they were trickling in day by day. And when I was working with my clients during that period of time on crisis communication, every day we would talk and we would say, all right, what do we know today? What are the questions we still need answers to? Let's put those over here and we might get answers to those tomorrow, but here's the information we know today, here are the answers we got today, and here are the actions we can take as a result of getting those answers today. You can come out of a crisis looking pretty good if you're ready, because ready always wins. So let's talk a little bit about your crisis team. Your organization may not have all these titles and roles. Maybe you're a small business or you don't even have this many people in your entire team. And that's okay, because this is not really about people specifically. This is about roles and responsibilities. So it could be that in your small business, one or maybe two people take on all of these responsibilities. CEO is the ultimate top level executive decision maker. The CIO, Chief Information Officer, is the person who communicates things to key stakeholder groups. Finance is writing the checks, keeping money flowing. HR takes care of staffing and human resources. And COO, Chief Operating Officer, makes sure that the trains are running on time, right? Making sure that operations is taking place and things, supplies, things like that are happening as they need to. The goal here is to get you thinking about the fact that you need a chief, you need a money person, you need a people person, and you need an ops person. And that doesn't have to be all different people. Like I said before, that could be just a few people, and sometimes it's even one person. But don't forget these areas. Make sure they all get a voice and make sure they're all heard and at that table. These three need to report, the finance, HR, and COO need to report up to the CEO. And they need to be in constant coordination with that communication person, that CIO. So you'll notice on this graphic that I didn't have the CIO report to the CEO, even though in normal times, yes, of course, they probably would. But they are right up there as sort of like a dotted line, and an individual in a role that is critical to helping collaborate with the CEO on an ongoing basis. And in times of crisis, man, that's sometimes multiple times a day. Sometimes it's all day, every day for periods of time. Don't be afraid to do overkill. Don't be afraid to have multiple calls, multiple meetings in a day. This is sometimes what's required. These roles, though, do need to be identified during non-crisis time. And so that when crisis hits, everyone knows which role they play and that, in fact, they are needed in that war room. So when you activate your emergency command, here's where you start. Once again, back to these objectives. And it's important, again, not to wait for the crisis to develop these. Everything you do and say should be supportive of these during a crisis. So if you make a decision to produce something, to communicate something, if it doesn't support these three things, if it doesn't support the way you want people to feel, the things you want them to think, and the things you want them to do, it's probably not an important thing to do at that time. So the roles we talked about earlier, these are the things that each of those individuals are responsible for during a crisis. So HR is responsible for people. That means that taking stock of the human resources you have that you can access and how to access them, how to keep them safe, sometimes how to get them into work, how to get them fed, how to keep them there. I mean, thinking about all the different types of crises that you might encounter, whether it's severe weather or a healthcare scare or something, there are all kinds of different factors that you need to consider, but HR is responsible for making sure the organization has the people it needs to get the work done. Finance is responsible for money, obviously, keeping it flowing, writing checks, coordinating emergency measures if needed, so applying for grants, government assistance. Many of you have done this over the last few weeks, so you know what I'm talking about. Operations is responsible for, among other things, stuff. So equipment, vehicles, materials, supplies, making sure that they're keeping an eye on the changes in supply chain and things like that that might be taking place during a crisis. And the leadership, that's in the center, and that's where your CEO goes. The buck stops with them. They see everything. They sign off on every decision. And although your organization may have the type of culture and workflow that does not require the CEO to sign off on everything during regular times, when you're in an intense planning period during a crisis, it's a good idea for that team, this small team of these roles, to be very much on the same page and very frequently in communication every single day. Now, information, that's your chief information officer role, and that person gathers and coordinates, they synthesize, they filter, and then they disseminate information. The flow of information is important all the time, honestly, for organizations and businesses, but it's especially critical in a time of crisis. So bad information, or even a lack of good information, right, even a vacuum, can be the difference in some cases, depending on what field you're in, between life and death. So it's absolutely critical that all of the information being communicated to your key audiences, that bubble on the right, be they customers or prospects or staff or patients or clients or whoever your audiences are, it's absolutely critical that that information begin and come initially from that core team over on the left, the bubbles, the circles on the left. It is then processed, again, like I said, and disseminated by that CIO and pushed out to the audiences. And you have to decide who those audiences are, so you can decide what you want them to feel, think, and do after they've gotten your message. Now, you've probably all heard and maybe even come to believe along the way that it's almost never a good idea to say no comment. You probably heard people say that, never say no comment when you're asked a question by media or other key stakeholders. This is even more important advice during a crisis. People's emotions are heightened. They are laser focused because they're looking for a specific piece of information, or they're scared, or they're worried, or upset, or anxious, and they're on the lookout for details. So if you're quiet or you're refusing to answer questions or communicate, it is going to look like you're hiding something. Regarding accepting responsibility, again, I want to remind you that sometimes this can look like rising to the occasion or accepting a mantle of responsibility or authority. And that's what you're looking for here, especially when you're in one of those cases where what's happening was not your fault. It was not something you did. Again, you did not start this fire, but you can put it out. So people often talk about building the airplane in the air, which sounds very hard and very impressive. And they talk about it like this is something that they should be proud of. And if you're building the airplane in the air, like a lot of us have been over the last few weeks and months, it is. It's pretty impressive. But often people are out there on the wing when they didn't really need to, when they could have just been prepared. And one of the most important skills to flex during a crisis is that of speed and decisiveness. You need to be able to access information you need to make good decisions and make them quickly. So as a team, this is a list of questions that as soon as disaster strikes, as soon as you find yourself in an emergency prepared or an emergency situation or some kind of crisis, you need to answer these questions early. And you need to make sure that among that core team, that leadership team, everybody has created consensus about the answers to them. Because the answers to these will help you make all the following smaller, less consequential decisions easier to make. So first, what operational changes are necessary here? And part B of that is, what are the required changes versus what are the advisable changes? So let's take retail, small business retail in communities like the community, like inside Chemung County. Small business retail, when this began, I also own a retail business, and we took some precautions. We were bleaching doorknobs, and we were, we weren't wearing masks at that time, but I think we had some gloves, and we were wiping down surfaces. And then all of a sudden, so that was it seemed like a good idea category of stuff. And then all of a sudden, the government said, yep, we're taking that out of your hands. You have to close. And so that all of a sudden was the required operational change. So from there, since we couldn't open our doors anymore, we had to have conversations and make decisions quickly about how are we going to still sell things when we can't have any people in our store. So the things we did were we amped up our online presence. We started offering different things, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the examples of that later in the discussion. The second question is, given those operational changes, once you've decided the things that you need to do differently in this climate, can you afford to make them? What kinds of expenses do you need to incur? So in cases like this, some people purchased webcams. I know that because some folks told me they were trying to buy webcams in the middle of this and they couldn't get them because they were all on back order. So if you didn't have that, all of a sudden that becomes very important. You need to buy a subscription to WebEx or to Zoom. Everybody's an expert on Zoom now. So these are some operational changes that are sort of more like supplies related, but then there are also operational changes related to staffing, related to facilities, related to utilities. And so once you've decided the things you need to do, you need to determine, what can we afford and how is our change in revenue going to impact our ability to afford those things. The third question is, do we have enough people, and are the people we have the right people? Some of the folks that you have on your team are terrific and they're great in peacetime. And I keep saying peacetime, and maybe that's not exactly perfect, but they're great in typical time, non-corona time, we'll say. But they're not who you need in a crisis. And you know that pretty quick. Once you're in a crisis, you can see the folks that respond well, that are able to be nimble, that are quick, and then the folks that aren't, who get really freaked out and nervous and they can't manage and they can't move quickly or be responsive. So you need to know if you have enough people to make the operational changes that you need to make, and if the folks you have are the right people. Number 4 is you need to determine what your customers or your clients or the members of the public, your constituents, whoever your audiences are, what do they expect from you and what do they need from you? So if you're a retail shop like mine that sells books, that was not a first day of quarantine concern. First day of quarantine concern was, if you remember, what are we going to do with these kids that can't go to school anymore? How are we going to manage that online learning? Let's talk about public services. Let's make sure our seniors are okay. Nursing homes are safe. Let's make sure that our food bank is operational, that there's enough donations coming in there to meet the increased need. And then we started getting calls at our bookstore. Like, okay, now we're stuck. I need something to read. And so you need to understand that and be able to predict that to a certain extent with the knowledge of what you do and what role it plays in the response from your customers and your clients. Number 5, what communications channels do we have at our disposal? Now, in this case, in COVID-19 pandemic, we are able to use WebEx. We're able to use Zoom. We're able to use our texting and our calls and our FaceTime. Thank goodness. I mean, these have been a lifeline for people. But in cases of severe weather, for example, sometimes we're not able to use a lot of those. And so it's very important to take stock of what are the channels that we would typically use, what are the channels that are currently at our disposal, and what aren't. Number 6 is, what is your true north? If you are in the nonprofit world, you have a mission statement. You have things that you must absolutely do. If you do nothing else, you must do this. Maybe that's making sure that the people who are residents in your skilled nursing facility are safe. Maybe that's, if you're in education, getting access to online education tools for every student in your district. Every organization, every business has a different true north, but it's the one thing you have to do no matter what. And so it's important for your leadership team, your crisis response team, to agree on what that one thing or two things are that you must accomplish no matter what. And then the flip side of that is number 7, what are your deal breakers? What can we absolutely under no circumstances tolerate? And that's really, really important to acknowledge as well. In terms of channels, email is a very important channel. You might use that all the time, but you might be using it very differently in the case of a crisis. In-person meetings and briefings, some of you may have used tools like WebEx and Zoom regularly before we weren't allowed to gather together for this period of time, but many people didn't. And so this is a great tool. It allows us to get together and share information, and it's significant, obviously, and all of us are feeling that right now. Mail and shipping. So sometimes there are delays in this. Has anyone tried to order anything off of Amazon lately and gotten the message that they're delayed? We're also used to getting our 2-day shipping, but all of a sudden it's like weeks sometimes for certain items. Or in the case of, like, I guess, sanitizer and toilet paper, you can't get that here. So mail and shipping, you need to understand the impact on the channel, whether it's been impacted, delayed, slowed, operating differently, and what to expect so you can keep your organization running in some similar way to the way that your customers or clients expect and the way that you need it to work. Social media has been really important in this particular crisis for many small businesses. There have been pages and initiatives that have launched that have been designed just exclusively to help. In our area, there's a page just designed to help people know what takeout options are available, and that's on Facebook. So just sort of people have been really creative and doing interesting stuff using social media, not just to stay in touch with friends, but to basically stay in touch with customers as well. Texting, obviously, I know I've used that a lot more with customers and clients than I ever have during this period of time. And then finally, mass media or traditional media. And one of the neat things that I've seen is that some of the local stations are doing their news broadcasts from home. So that's been really neat to see, and they've just adapted and done that. Oh, yes. Okay. The virtual online meetings. One note I made was, I hope you all know that in some of these tools, you can change your backgrounds. So that's just a little tip. Next time you show up to a meeting, you can say, like, hey, I'm in the Bat Cave. That's a lot of fun. And I've definitely done it more than once. So those are the channels. I've covered some of the questions that you want to ask. I purposely did not want to get into a lot of detail when it came to execution, because I know we have a pretty diverse group of folks here from lots of different organizations, both like in terms of size and in terms of what you do. So I wanted to make sure to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. So Emily, is this a good time to go ahead and launch into some questions from our attendees?
Sure. So for moving into the Q&A, just a reminder that you are welcome to turn on your audio and chime in during your question. Please feel free to utilize, there's a chat space in the application. Please feel free to enter in any questions there. And I think we can just maybe give a moment or two to see if we have any questions come in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned before there was some examples from the retail business that I operate. One of the things that we've done is created some special gift packs and also added local delivery, which we can do just wearing masks and using gloves. So that's been really well received, and it's an additional step, but it's a way to stay connected with your customers, and it's a way to make sure that you can continue to have revenue coming in. So that's been something that we've done that's been pretty good. Another fun thing that we did was offered some virtual shopping options. And so in a bookstore, this works pretty well because you can just say, you can make appointments and you can do FaceTime or a Zoom call with someone and just walk them through and show them some of the new things that you have. And it's a one-on-one, and you just kind of ring them up over the phone and you can set up a shipment or a delivery to them.
Dusty, I have a question. Have you seen any particularly great examples of communication during this crisis that you'd like to mention?
I feel like I've seen a lot of really good examples of communication during the crisis. I do think that one of the things, actually one of the first things that comes to mind is some of the communication that the Chemung Chamber has done. I mean, you all have sort of decided early on, like, this is the kind of information that our members need and we believe want during this time. And you also recognize that the information was changing really quickly every day. So you've been doing regular push outs via email and other channels of, hey, here's the news today. Here are the announcements that came today, whether it's from, Governor Cuomo's briefings or federal government support that's been put in place. So all of the organizations that are in place to support businesses that I work with and that I've seen locally and regionally have been doing a really outstanding job of that.
We appreciate that, Dusty. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dusty, I received another question. Would you be able to talk a little about communicating with employees during the crisis and as a result of the crisis?
So during the crisis and as a result of the crisis?
How that affects communication with employees?
Okay, sure. So I think that, when we back up to the discussion of human resources during a crisis, one of the first things that you have to do, especially when you've got a team of any size, is take stock of who you've got access to, who can come in, who can help, and kind of making sure that you've got the right skill sets in place. That's the first step, and that's like the triage step, right? Making sure that you can still keep the lights on and keep people working and keep your customers or your patients or whoever it is getting what they need. But one of the things that an organization can do, and frankly really kind of has to do during a crisis, is not just push information out, but take every opportunity to listen to. And particularly, you've got to listen to your customers, you've got to listen to your clients and your external audiences, but you've got to listen to your internal folks too. You may have heard people use this phrase before, but I think it's really critical for people on that crisis team, between Zoom calls, between calls with state organizations or funders or whoever, to do that management by walking around and walking through the halls, walking through your organization and talking to people and checking in on them. Look in their faces, look in their eyes, see how they're doing. Are they tired? Are they exhausted? Are they at the end of their rope? Are they worried? Are they worried about like their work, or are they worried about their families or something else that you haven't thought of? You can't solve all their problems, but you can show them that you care about them, and you may be able to solve some of them. So it's really important to make sure to listen to folks, because again, communication is a two-way street. So you need them to have information that they need in order to do their job. But if they burn out and they're not able to function at a typical level, that's a problem for you. And of course, it's a problem for them too, personally. So making sure that they know that you care, and that's just the first step, and just listening and finding out what people need that maybe you haven't thought of before. That can be done, by the way, from, either by soliciting, written comments. One organization that I work with had an employee write on a comment on a Facebook post that they made. Someone had brought, a local business or some organization had brought meals for a group of people that worked in the organization. And a staff member who wasn't part of that group that got the meals wrote a comment on the post that was developed just to thank and make people feel good, about, hey, well, how come we didn't get meals? Well, so maybe not the best manners, but at the same time, that's an important message that those leaders needed to hear. So they were able to circle back, talk to that group, talk to that individual, make sure they knew and recognized how valued they were, and actually take steps to provide meals for them too. Because why not? Make people feel good about the work. It's tough, and everybody's really worried right now. There's a question in the chat about how do you go about getting tested if you're an essential worker? I do not know the answer to that, and I would not want to. I mean, I've read some things and I have heard some things, but I would not want to speak to that just because I'm not coming to you from a healthcare organization or a state perspective. So I'm sorry, it's just not really in my area of expertise.
I'll just chime in for a minute, Dusty. It's Kamala Keeley with the Chamber. And Yvette, I saw your question, and it's my understanding that most of the facilities in Corning and also in Ithaca are drive-through facilities. So when you get tested, you actually are in your car, so you're not around anybody else. It's not like a waiting room situation. And right now, those are, I'm not sure where we have any testing sites locally, how they're handling it, but most of the tests that are being referred from the area are getting tested both either in Corning or in Ithaca, and they're both drive-through. So you wouldn't be around other people. If you have more questions about that, shoot us an email and we'll get some more details for you. Thanks. See, Dusty, I get to answer the bad questions in a crisis. That's my job.
That's good. I'm glad you had an answer to that, because that is not what I knew.
Dusty, we received another question. In terms of all the shifts that are taking place in the workplace right now, and then with the reopening process, do you have any suggestions for best practices on communicating to customers when reopening takes place?
So yes, I do, and thanks for that question. I think that some people are feeling like they can't do much until they learn what this phased approach that Governor Cuomo has been speaking about looks like. But I would encourage people to begin to put some plans in place, knowing what we know, that it's probably going to take place, or it's probably going to happen or look like something within a defined universe of options. And by that I mean, probably it's going to be some kind of phased approach. Probably it's going to be some kind of thing that lasts some period of time, whether it's a month or several months. And so within a range, we kind of have a sense of how it's going to look. So there is some planning that we can do, particularly from a communication standpoint, without knowing precisely when and precisely how. So I would go back to the discussion of, first of all, audiences. So who is it that we would need to communicate with? You need to make a list of those folks, and you need to determine what those people need to know in order to do, quote, their job. So if that audience is your employees, then we're literally talking about what they need to know to do their job. So that could be information about when the reopening is going to take place. That could be information about how many people we will be able to have, what our operational changes will be if we need to limit the number of people in a particular space. If we're thinking about customers or clients, that's a different communication. Those folks, their job is to be customers and clients in this equation. So we need them to know how to continue to access services, buy products, and reach us, in terms of communication. So although we may not now, as of today, be able to say to our audiences and our customer base, okay, on May 16th or whatever, this is how it's going to work, we can get ready for that. so that when that knowledge is known, that we can pull the trigger on those communications. I think it's important to remember too, particularly with our public audiences, so customers and clients, that information is going to need to be communicated several times across several channels. So I would go back to your list of channels that you typically use, and this would not be the time to introduce new channels. This is not the time to get creative and say, oh, we're going to have a TikTok. Nothing against TikTok, but this is not the time to change up the way you're doing this. Use the channels that people are expecting. Use the channels that they already go to get information from you, and make sure that you're reinforcing information and sending it regularly and repeatedly over that period of time. I hope that helps a little bit. If there's anything specific that you want to discuss more, happy to do that.
Thank you. That's great. I did have a few other quick questions, but I just wanted to give a little bit of space. If there is anyone who joined in by phone who would like to chime in and ask a question, please feel free to do so. I'll just hold on my next question for a minute here.
And while you do that, I mean, I think just something to remember, if you've got a question that you're thinking about now or later, when it comes to communication, go back to that list of audiences and what do you need those audiences to feel, think, and do. That will give you your roadmap every time, because although you may not know, okay, how to perfectly create a new social media presence that, you know, meets the needs of the changed environment, that's okay. You can get help with that, but you know where to start, because you know that'll help you get going on developing those communications objectives.
Okay, we received a question in the chat here. Any additional tips for moving forward as these reopening phase plans are starting to trickle out?
So that's going to look pretty different depending on what your industry is, what field you're in. In retail, you know, that feels easier because you can do some management of people in your space. You can do some HR, decisions to make sure that you've got the right folks in, and not too many. And you can do a lot of the things that you've been doing already online and via email to try to get, interest, and you can also do reopening events, as long as you don't, exceed gathering restrictions as they phase back up. If you're thinking about other types of organizations, be they, nonprofit, or if you're in the healthcare or sort of adjacent industries, just make sure, so I would say use the communication you've been doing already as a foundation. And I'm making some assumptions here that you've been, in touch with your folks and listening to folks and creating channels that they can give you feedback and ask you questions. And I hope that you have. And if you have, use those as the foundation, and then consider whether some of the communication channels you've adopted or tools or practices you've adopted during this period of time can evolve and be adapted for typical operating time. So for example, I'll use the retail, and this won't apply to everybody, but think about how it might apply to you. Those retail organizations retail businesses that have adopted delivery and added delivery as a service. Well, maybe you didn't have delivery 3 months ago, but you're doing a lot of deliveries now. Maybe you should have delivery in May and June and beyond. And so what would that look like? Can you afford to do that? Can you pull that off? And is that actually of value? So think about things you've adopted here that you want to keep in normal times as things reopen. And in terms of communicating those things, again, use the channels that you've been using, and take this opportunity to build your following on social media so that you can get that information out in front of more people, build your mailing list so you can email more people. This is the time, because we can't gather, we can't get together. People are used to getting information this way now who weren't before. So it's a good idea to capitalize on that and make sure that you can transition now back into regular times, but still use some of these best practices.
Dusty, we just had another question about, in terms of, are there any specific suggestions for like how to write during COVID-19 or a crisis scenario, and also the tone of voice that is most appropriate?
Yeah, I do have some specific suggestions. That's a really good question. I think, we have to start by considering where our audiences are coming from and where their heads are when we're communicating to them. We have to consider that if you're writing an email, we don't know when they're going to open that. They might open it as they're waiting 6 feet away from the person in front of them at the grocery store, and they're looking around and making sure that no one is crowding them and getting in their space. They may open it after they just put their kid to bed, and their kid is upset and worried about getting germs, and they have been struggling for weeks with trying to figure out the best way to explain this complicated situation to a young child. They may be, so we don't know where their head is, and so we need to create communications that kind of are not generic, but neutral enough that they can meet people where they are. So what does that mean? Compassion is a huge piece. We want to make sure that we express compassion for the recipient, whether that's a recipient of an email, someone who's reading a social media post, or whatever. We want to be compassionate. We want to show that we understand this is a complicated time, that people are experiencing it in a lot of different ways, depending on a lot of different factors. We want to think really hard before we try to insert humor into our communications at this point in time. On the one hand, it might add some much needed levity, and it might be appreciated. On the other hand, it might, depending on the field and the topic you're writing about, it might come off as though you are minimizing the crisis, or in some way sort of trivializing what people might be going through. So really consider that. So I would say, think about the mindset that, as to the extent that you can predict it, of the recipient of your message and how you want them to feel when they get it. And then consider that humor piece, because I've had several folks ask about that and think, okay, maybe this is the time for us to do this, and it's probably not. So I would just be very cautious about that. Do consider, though, again, back to those three, and I don't want to be a broken record, but how you want people to feel, that's the way you write. If you want them to feel taken care of, looked out for, looked in on, write that way, write in a caring tone. If you want them to think that you're a compassionate leader, that you really do care about them, make sure to say that. It's okay to just say things point blank. And if you want them to do something, go ahead and ask them to do it. Give them a call to action.
Thank you, Dusty. That's very helpful. I think we can maybe just do one last call for questions and we can wrap things up.
Certainly.
I'll just leave one more minute here for any lingering questions.
While you wait, just in case anyone else does have a question, Emily, I just want to say to the folks that are on the call, I recognize a lot of your names. I wish we were all in the same room together. That part of this is a little bit of a drag, but I know in many cases, as I'm looking at this list of names, I know the work that you all are putting in. And so for whatever it's worth, I congratulate and thank you, because never mind the worries that we all have about our kids or our aging parents or whatever the case may be. We bring those with us everywhere we go. But we are all worried about funding and donors and customers and revenues and what's going to come next. And yet we're getting up and we're putting in the day and we're working hard and we're trying to be creative. And we're showing up to try to learn more about how we can do that better. So honestly, you're to be congratulated, and I truly appreciate that you kind of decided to jump in on this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Dusty. We really appreciate your time in this presentation, and we really appreciate everybody who joined in today as well.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody.